Hey, did y'all know that pain can actually ruin you? Yep, it can. I know many of us know about our aunties, our uncles, our cousins that we can look back and say they were following Jesus, but they were quite bitter. Their heart was hardened, they weren't kind. And even though they were following Jesus, it did not make following Jesus appealing. And there is a reason to that. So today we're going to talk about how your pain can actually handicap your faith. But before we do, I want to establish two different definitions, right? So we have a surrendered pain and we have an unsurrendered pain. What unsurrendered pain is pain that you are the keeper of, the manager of. You haven't released it to the Lord, but it's still in your hands. And what leads that unsurrendered pain is your emotional condition or your circumstances. That is what leads it, what fuels it, and what guides it, right? So that's the type of pain that can destabilize your faith. But then we do have another pain, and it's a surrendered pain. This is a type of pain that you have entrusted to God. You have you have come to the reality of what is going on, and you have handed the circumstances, the situations, and yourself to God. You've surrendered it to him. And you've told him, look, I'm going to trust you with this pain. And whatever you decide to do with it, even if that means that you don't remove it. But I'm entrusting myself and my circumstances to you. That is surrender pain. But today we're going to talk about unsurrendered pain and how that keeping and managing of your own pain actually can cause your heart to get hardened. So let's start with one of the reasons that unsurrendered pain destabilizes your faith. The number one reason is that it impacts your ability to have communication, authentic communication with God, i.e., your prayer life. In Psalm 18, 2, it says, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. See, what unsurrendered pain does to communication with God is that it convinces us that God is not who he says that he is, right? We see here in Psalm 18, 1 through 2, how David declares the role of God in his pain. He says that's his strength, that God is his deliverer, that God is his fortress, his very salvation. And that role of God in David's circumstances are the exact same role of God in our circumstances. But what unsurrendered pain does is it causes us to abandon this truth for God, this truth about God, and then we exchange it for something that helps us to cope and to make us feel better. So for me, what that was is because of my own personal childhood trauma, my inclination was to have an avoidant type of behavior. So I exchanged the truth of God being all of that for me to just not thinking about my reality. I'm just not going to think about it. It's not that I'm not aware of it, but I'm certainly not going to embrace it. And I'm definitely not going to talk to God about it. Why? Because to talk to God about it makes me recall the pain of it. And that's the very thing I was trying to run away from. So what that unsurrendered pain did was it told me that God could not be my deliverer, but me avoiding the situation would be my deliverer. And we both know that that is not true, right? Well, in that moment, it feels so real though, right? So in my subconscious, I began to believe that God was in deficit. He couldn't be all that I need, even though he had already declared himself to be able to be all that I need. So I just avoided thinking about it. And I avoided embracing that was my new reality. Instead, I lived in another reality that allowed for me to just cope. Because as we both know, just because you're going through something does not mean life doesn't keep being life, right? I had to still get up and go to work. I had to still get up and be there for my children, for my husband, in spite of the depression and everything that I was going through. And so for me in that time, I chose to keep that pain close to me rather than surrender it to God, because to surrender it to God meant to actually have to eventually deal with it. And I thought it would destroy me and then not allow me to be able to cope with the things that I had to show up for. So what happens is whatever your exchange is, whatever you look to, whether it's men, whether it's alcohol, whether it's partying, whether it's adventure, whether it's ambition, whatever it is that you have exchanged God for, what that does is it temporarily relieves you, but it also decreases your appetite to want to actually convene with the one who actually can do anything about your circumstances, or the one who can actually deliver or heal or protect and keep you. So we do this unequal exchange for temporary relief. And I'm wondering, like, as you're listening to this, think about some things that you may have exchanged God for, even if it was not intentional, even if it was just for the sake of getting through the next day. What is that thing? And know that in us doing that, a part of the root is that we have not fully surrendered this pain to God. And now what happens is when we do that, we uninvite our very life source from being our life source. In John 16:33, it says this. When Jesus is talking to his disciples, y'all, he just dropped a whole lot of bad news. And he ends it with this. He says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. So we see this deception, right? We see that what happens is our peace, our joy, and our freedom that we are so desiring in this moment is actually the is actually only in Christ. So when we haven't surrendered that pain to him, we cut off our own access to true relief. Now this reason, the reason why we might think about, oh, the relief that I'm getting from what I'm doing versus what Jesus is doing is because we know subconsciously that his relief may look very different than what we have already cultivated and what we create. And we want what is ours. But Christ is letting us know in this, and he was letting his disciples know that it is only in him that we get that true relief. So that cut off of communication with God from him being our source and him being our true relief is only a deficit to us. It keeps us in prolonged seasons of pain when we don't allow him to be the one that we look to and that we communicate to and that we seek wisdom and guidance from in the midst of our pain. Because what happens is with honest communication with God, it cultivates an intimacy with God, right? It's a deeper knowing of God. And as you know him more, it naturally changes and transforms your perspective, not only on your circumstances, but on yourself in the midst of your circumstances. And that's why it's so important that he be who we look to, because that joy, that peace, and that faith that we're looking for comes from us seeing him rightly. All right. So I want to encourage you in this. Know that this pain that you're keeping close, even though you feel like it's giving you that temporary relief, it's keeping you from the true freedom that your soul desires. Right. And so the reality of this is this as well. I have been in times where, y'all, my heart was so broken, like, especially during my miscarriages, and it was during a season where, like, my husband and I, we were just not getting along. We didn't even know if we were gonna make it, and my heart was so broken, y'all, that I couldn't talk. Like, literally, words were counterintuitive because my soul was just so overwhelmed with just depression and grief, and there are places and times where your soul can be so overwhelmed. Talking to God is just like, even if you have the desire to do it, you don't have the strength to do it. And I know this is true also because in Psalm 77, verses 3 through 4, Asaph says this. He said, I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. Sis, this may be your reality. You may be like, Tierra, my world just got rocked. I can't find my steady footing. I don't Not only do I not have the strength to say anything, I don't even know what to say. All I have are my tears. Sis, I'm there with you. I know that. I know that moment. And God has provided grace in that space. What I would say, sis, just go sit in his presence. Sit in his presence. Turn some worship music on and don't say a word. Just sit. Ask the Lord to give you visions of him being who he has always declared himself to be to you. Because even in you just sitting is a demonstration of faith. Because it's saying, in God, my soul is heavy, my heart is heavy, but you hear what I can't speak. So I want to encourage you, even if you are in that place where words can't come, sit in his presence, sit in a room, go take a walk, and let him wash over you with his love and compassion because there's grace for that space. All right, number two, another thing that unsurrendered pain does to weaken your faith is that it isolates you. It causes you to be driven away from community. I know for myself, just naturally my personality is to go, I'm an introvert. So I go internal. So it might not I might not necessarily want to go, hey, let me go call you. You pray for me. Let me go plug in. Naturally, I go internal. I go in my mind, right? But in Hebrews 10:23-25, it says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. For he who has promised is faithful. I got that tattooed right here. And let us consider how we may spur or urge one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Like this is a joke between me and my friends. Like we are always talking about how he mentions encourage each other as long as it is today, because baby, we be needing encouragement all the time. God knew, and thank God uses a sympathetic towards our weaknesses because we be needing constant encouragement. But we see that God's family is one of the instruments that he uses to allow for healing in our time of suffering and to help us to even carry the burdens that we have by having people to support us, right? He's given all of his children different spiritual gifts, different talents, right? All for the purpose of edification. That means I have a sister, I have a really dear friend that's close to my heart who is closer than a sister, and she is gifted in encouragement and compassion. So during my time, and Liz, girl, thank God for you. Liz was right there to continue to encourage me in the Lord, to have compassion on me when I was down, right? And so God has constructed his family for the purposes of encouraging you and helping you to bear the weight. But see what unsurrendered pain does in this isolation is it cultivates a different community, because the reality is whether you intentionally lean into the community that God has given you through his family, there is another community that you will lean into passively. And this community is created by Satan. And the members of this party you don't want to have anything to do with. The members of this party are your unsurrendered emotions. They are your circumstances being a god. They are his lies and the narratives that he puts in. So even though you have not plugged into the community that God has given you to help you to support, this community is going to start getting real, real loud. And what you'll see is that a hopelessness and a despair will come, because now you don't have people who God has given you to fortify you, to help protect your mind and your soul from the lies of the enemy. Because when pain comes and grief comes, you are in a very vulnerable state. You're in a very vulnerable state, especially when it comes to your identity, right? And so, even though we have the temptation to like unplug from God's community, we have to ask God to help us to resist that. Because honestly, the other community that will naturally fall into place when you reject the one he has offered is a lot more detrimental. Satan is an accuser. So all he's going to do is he's going to accuse you, he's going to accuse your circumstances, he's going to accuse people that offended you, keep you in vicious cycles of unforgiveness, bitterness, and resentment. And so, because God has given us his family, it is so important that we allow him to deal with our pain in the midst of community and not in isolation. Another thing that this lack of community does is it progresses the hardening of your heart. One of the things that community does is they speak truth, right? They're encouraging you in the Lord. But when you are in isolation and you're by yourself, and now you have leaned in passively to this other community, your heart grows cold, not only towards your circumstances, but towards God, right? And the hardening of it progresses because you are constantly being inundated with lies, with accusations, and just with the sheer reality of what's going on, right? And so I want to encourage you that if you're struggling with plugging into a local church, if you're struggling with godly friends that can help support you during your time of need and help guide you in the right direction when your flesh and your emotions say go elsewhere, I want you to encourage you to look into just a local church. And even the more, comment in the description box. If you are a sister and you're like, look, I need community. I need support. Because that is another part of this podcast, is to develop community so that we could come alongside each other, so that we can journey through not only the hills, but also the valleys. So sis, plug in, plug in, plug in. And the last thing that unsurrendered pain does is it decreases your appetite for truth. So I'm going to read Psalm 1, hmm, Psalm 1, 1 through 3. And if you're driving, don't turn to it. All right, Psalm 1, 1 through 3. It says, blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on it day and night. That person, and let's focus here, that person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruit in its season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. See, what unsurrendered pain does is it makes us comfortable living in a lie. And it also makes us it makes us comfortable living in a broken state. And I'm not talking about the brokenness that is good, a broken and contrite heart. I'm just saying a brokenness that leads to fruit that is bitter and resentful and just angry, right? When we walk, like it said in verses 1, in the counsel and lean into counsel with people who agree with our broken state of thinking concerning our pain, there is a progression of comfortability with this lifestyle, right? This lifestyle of living independent of God's truth. And so it's very subtle. You don't just start there and be like, "Oh yeah, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm reading things, I'm watching things that affirm things that are contrary to God's way concerning the matter that I'm in." It's very subtle. You start with seeing something scroll on Instagram, and it sounds really good. And then next thing you know, you're watching stuff on YouTube, you're ingesting all of these ways that are cardinal and counter kingdom, that you become accustomed to adopting a mentality that is outside of God. It's independent of his truth. But we see in verses 2 through 3, right? His truth positions us to be in a position of flourishing. Let me read that again. The person, that person, and he's talking about this person that delights in the Lord and delights in his word, is like a tree planted by streams of water. What this says is that this person that's delighting in God's ways, it positions us to be in a place where we can be nourished. It positions us in a place where we can bear fruit, even though our seasons are cyclical and they change, as some of them are easier and harder than the other. But when we don't delight in his ways, it positions us in a place for our leaves to wither, to grow dry. And what that would look like is we bitter. You might be bitter. You might stay in a place of anger. And don't get me wrong, there is place for anger in the whole grieving cycle. But the issue is being stuck there. And what happens is when we start to feed ourselves lies and we start to digest ways of life and thinking that are counter kingdom, like I said, we start to uproot our own selves and plant ourselves in a a soil that is not fertile. But God lets us know right here, The person that is planted like a tree by streams of water, they will bear fruit in season. Meaning, being in God's word, following God's way, having an appetite for God's truth allows us to bear fruit in season, meaning there is something that will be produced even if the season is hard. But when we are not positioned in the context of eating and meditating on truth versus meditating on things that just make us feel better, we'll find ourselves captive to these theologies and these doctrines that don't lead to life. They won't lead. They might give you a temporary relief. They might give you a temporary pat on the back, but baby, they will not sustain you. You will find yourself continuously going to broken cisterns. Now, while leaning into God's truth initially can be counterintuitive, especially when you just been rocked with something and your heart is in despair, it is also the only place that you will eventually find life, that you find provision. Because me and my husband, we started gardening last year. And anyone that knows me know they're like, Tierra, what you mean you gardening? You don't even like to be outside. But I garden and I love it now. And one thing that it has taught me is that God has a specific way in which he does things. From the planting of the seed to the type of soil, to the season in which it bears fruit, to the pruning, to the harvesting. There are so many different stages that God has for to produce fruit. And when we neglect to surrender ourselves and submit ourselves to what he says is the right way, the narrow way, this is the way to life, we only do ourselves harm. And what it does is it not progresses, it prolongs your season of pain. It causes you to go around mountains that you didn't necessarily have to go around. And believe me when I say I did that. I did it for years simply because I chose to avoid to surrender this pain. I avoided the reality that I was in. And what that caused for me to do was to go in cycles because I had not submitted to the way in which God says, walk this out with me. I'm your God. I'm your deliverer. I'm your savior. Be still and know that I am God. And what that unsurrendered pain that you've been holding tight to you does is it keeps you from the very freedom that you're looking for, sis. So I want to encourage you in this. I always like to give some practical steps on like what's next. One thing, unsurrendered pain is a stage that we all go through. I don't know a person yet that has not been through a season where something caught them off guard and their immediate reaction was either to manipulate, to avoid, or to abort, right? And it's not until we get to the end of ourselves in that season that we then recognize that the only way is God. I can't do it. We all go through those stages. The point that I'm pressing with these are that I don't want you to get stuck there. I don't want you to reside there. Journey through it. Don't get stuck there. And one way that we recognize that we're there is through the knowledge of, yeah, I have not surrendered it. I stopped praying. I'm not really engaged with any form of community. Um, I'm watching and digesting stuff that I wouldn't typically digest or have an interest for, but now I'm almost addicted to it. These are indicators that there may be something that you're holding on to that God wants you to surrender. And so some practical steps are this. I'm very much the advocate for doing the next small thing. I do not believe that any step towards obedience to the Lord is a small act, right? There are no small acts of faith towards God, right? All he requires is the faith of a mustard seed. So what I want you to do, if you find yourself in any of those three, do the simple thing as for some of y'all, answer that phone call you've been dodging. That's that sister or brother that have been trying to call you and get up with you. Answer that phone call. Lean into that church opportunity. Go to your room and just be silent with God. Do the next small thing. And what I can guarantee you is that every little small act of obedience grows your faith, and the produce from that development of faith are bigger acts of obedience. So, I hope that you enjoyed this lesson, this talk, because my heart for you is to be free. But more important in my heart, God's heart is for you to be free. And so, if you find yourself in any of these things, I'm praying that God will speak to your heart and that He will provide you your next small step towards Him as an act of obedience, saying to Him that you want to be free, that you want to be healed, that you don't want to stay in the current position that you're in. And if this was a blessing to you, if you think, if you got any wisdom from this and you know anyone who can benefit from this, share this video. Send it to that girl that you see is struggling right now and she can't find her footing. And if you like it, thumbs it up. And I also have some resources, some free resources on my website that I would love for you to gain access to. So if you go to www.tierralebbie.com, you'll find different worksheets and guides that can help to support you in getting unstuck out of this unsurrendered pain. But until next time, be blessed and know that God is with you.